listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Syria's capital, Damascus, fell to rebel fighters over the weekend in a move that sent the nation's president, Bashar al-Assad, fleeing the country. It comes after a 13-year civil war and over 5 decades of his family's brutal autocratic rule in the country. The rebels, led by Turkish-backed and registered terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, have declared the Assad regime over. That's a development that's been met with widespread celebration both within Syria and abroad.
At long last, the Assad regime has fallen. This regime brutalized and tortured and killed literally hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians. It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria. It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty.
But how did we get here, and who steps in now that a dictator has been toppled? Joining me now is Chair in Global Islamic Politics at Deakin University, Professor Greg Barton. Professor Greg, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. First off, what is the significance of what we've just witnessed in Syria over the weekend?
We've seen the very sudden collapse of a regime that was there for 54 years, a brutal regime under father and son, Bashar al-Assad being the son there since 2000. It happened like a bankruptcy, slowly at first, then all at once. And people, therefore, were caught by surprise. But the key group leading this coalition of rebel groups, HTS, a group that goes back to al-Qaeda and Islamic State in Iraq in 2012, this group says it's reformed, it's been working well, it's been carrying out good governance in the areas that it was leading in the northwest of Syria. And that gives some, cautious optimism that they can find a way of working out a new federation for Syria, because it's a very plural place.
I want to understand a little bit what life under the al-Assad regime was like. You did mention it was there in 2 parts. We know that his father, Hafez, was in power from 1971 to 2000 until he died, and then he passed on the reins to his son, Bashar. He took over in 2000. What was life like for Syrians under that family's rule?
Brutal, awful, so much so that taking their chances with a former al-Qaeda group of rebels was by far the better option, the lesser of the evils, than carrying on with this regime. When Bashar al-Assad was made to replace his father, he was only 34 at the time, people thought that this young London-trained eye doctor, he looks pretty moderate, this could be the beginning of a change. Many Syrians in exile were very positive. But very quickly, he sided with the most brutal of the Assad regime generals and carried out or continued crackdowns on dissidents. Syria is infamous for terrible prisons. We're seeing images this week of people being released from those prisons, sometimes after decades of being kept as political prisoners. For Syrians, there's just this uncertainty. It was sort of a little bit like what we've come to see in Russia more recently, where a state's gone from being authoritarian to totalitarian. That means it wants to listen in on all your conversations and punish you. It thinks you're a dissident force. So a life of fear. Syrians would say when they would phone from outside the country to family in the country, they'd use code words. They'd be very careful about who might be listening in on the conversation, so they didn't put anyone they were speaking to in Syria in danger. So you can imagine decades of that and people disappearing, kids who spray painted some graffiti and as a political protest being dragged away, some of them now re-emerging after decades in incarceration. Many, of course, in that lottery of people being taken out and executed in these prisons. These prisons were so notorious they had industrial crematoriums to deal with the bodies from executions.
So from the sounds of it, it appeared that their regime was targeting political opponents. What sort of other people were being targeted in the regime as well?
One thing I want to say about Syria and the Assad regime is Syria is a very plural country. It was a small Alawite minority community that Bashar al-Assad was aligned with that was ruling the country, very unusual sect, vague links with Shia Islam in Iran, but not direct links. From when Bashar al-Assad became president up until the Arab Spring protests of 2011, he pretty much had uninterrupted control, just imprisoned anyone who caused trouble. After the Arab Spring protests, he initially said he would do deals and move towards reforms, but that pretty quickly ran hollow. But that led to rebel groups, including what became HTS, taking over the north, particularly the northwest of the country. And then, of course, we saw Islamic State taking over the northeast of the country, now under the Syrian Democratic Forces. Assad didn't have the power to put them down. 8 years ago, His regime led a bid to retake the second largest city, Aleppo. They did that with the help of stormtroopers from Hezbollah and Iran and with air support from the Russians. Both of those forces were missing this last week and another moment of opportunity for the rebels. Assad had to make do then with a rump state that was only half the size of the previous Syria that he had ruled, but nevertheless contained the most important Mediterranean fertile coastal land and the areas in the south around Damascus. And for a long time, that seemed like a stable compromise. It was really a frozen conflict, and that frozen conflict didn't really change much for 8 years. But all this time, HTS in the northwest was apparently reforming itself, certainly trying to impress on locals that it could do good governance, collect the garbage, run the bakeries, keep the power on, and play nice with minority groups. So it was this change in circumstances this last week, the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah, pretty much complete collapse of Hezbollah leadership and command and control. Iran, similarly, its patron in a weak position. Russia, preoccupied with what's happening in Ukraine. That provided this window of opportunity for rebels, led by HTS. But, the capital, Damascus, fell from the south, not from the north, where HTS was coming, because there were rebels in the south who were secular, who joined in this window of opportunity.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about the allies there. You've touched on Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah kind of by proxy of Iran. Why did President Assad have the backing of both Russia and Iran whilst he was in power?
Well, both got key prizes from Assad. Russia got a warm water Mediterranean seaport in Tartus on the coast, of course, and then 60 k's north of that, Hamain air base. That was really key for Russia. It ran its notorious operations, including with the Wagner Group in Africa, out of that air base and out of that seaport. And that's been pretty important, particularly since it's lost access to the Black Sea now with what's happening in Ukraine. For Iran, Syria became its main prize, the so-called anchor of the fabled axis of resistance, as Tehran would style it. It was this nominally Shia minority group and other Shia groups in Syria, increasingly allied with Shia groups in Iraq, that was the backbone for this, along, of course, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, another Shia group, and the Houthis in Yemen, another Shia group. So for the Revolutionary Guards Corps regime in Tehran, Syria was the main achievement. That's now taken from them, just as it looks as if the Russians are going to lose that Tartus naval base and the Hamain air base.
I want to turn to the president now. There are reports that he's fled the country. Do we know where he is at the moment?
It seems to be strongly indicated that he's gone to Russia. One can envisage a sixth-floor apartment with a remarkable balcony that he may live to regret moving into. It's hard to imagine him having a happy and safe retirement in Russia, but that's his best option. The reports earlier of the family going to the UAE, there aren't many good options, and none of them are sort of really secure in the longer run. Bashar al-Assad is now a loser. Russia doesn't really support losers. He's an embarrassment. He was a liability. He was only from a Russian point of view, useful idiot when they could have a military base in Syria, similarly for the Iranians. All of that's gone now.
I do want to turn to the scenes of celebration that we're seeing coming out of Syria. We're seeing that, even being extended throughout parts of the Middle East. There are Syrians in Egypt right now that are celebrating. There are Syrians here in Australia. We know in Sydney yesterday they were taken to the streets in celebration. But undoubtedly, there's going to be some people who are saddened and even angered by the news. Who might those people be?
Well, there's a lot of people who are very anxious and fearful. I think for most Syrians inside Syria, outside Syria, going with the HTS-led alliance of rebel groups was by far the least worst evil, Assad being such a great evil. But if you're a member of the Alawite minority community that Assad was aligned with, you're stuck with who you are, how you're born. You would be fearful of retribution. So far, Jawlani, the leader of HTS, has shown restraint and said, look, there must be no retribution. He said we won't make the mistake that the American alliance did in Iraq after 2003 and have a so-called de-Baathification, that if you're part of the government party, we're going to force you into unpaid retirement. That's very sensible if you can hold to that. Of course, the other player we haven't mentioned so far is Turkey. Turkey is the sort of great patron of HTS, and not only do we need HTS to show restraint, but also Turkey to show restraint and not get too greedy.
Yeah, and I mean, we have kind of touched on it throughout this chat, but, HTS is one of several military factions across Syria, and their significance in this this story is that they've essentially led this rebellion in a way. Who are they, and what do we know about their rise to power specifically?
In many ways, they're pretty well known. Their leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, he was assigned from Islamic State in Iraq, formerly al-Qaeda in Iraq, to go into Syria. His name is nom de guerre, suggests his family's from the Golan Heights, the Jawlani, and he's been leading ever since 2012. In 2016, he said, we're going to break with al-Qaeda. We want to be a Syrian resistance group, not an al-Qaeda global player. And also we want to be more moderate. He was critical of Baghdadi, to be fair, for being too extreme, too anti-Shia. And in recent years, he's made a big point of saying the minorities can rest assured that there's a place in Syria for all Syrians, Christians, Druze, Alawites, all minorities. And in fact, in many ways, Syria is a nation of minorities. Well, there's a nominally Sunni majority, but it's a very plural place, one of the most plural places in the world. And Jawlani has gone from being clearly a Islamic State, an al-Qaeda man, to somebody who fought in Iraq, who was a foreign fighter, to somebody who's now at least showing restraint. I mean, he just recently did an interview with CNN and came across very reasonably. The question now, does he walk the talk? But it's a promising start. But, going back to an earlier point, if you're a minority community member, which means most Syrians, you're going to be fearful about whether at some stage you have a very Islamist. Think of Afghanistan and the Taliban. The Taliban came in and said, we'll be Taliban 2.0. We're modern, we're moderate. Well, nothing of the sort. At least the hardliners dominate now in Afghanistan. The fear is the same thing could happen in Syria.
Yeah, and speaking of that CNN interview, that was something that I watched over the weekend. It was very fascinating. There was a lot in there to unpack. I guess the biggest thing for me is that he's promising to run a moderate government, a Syrian government that's for all Syrians, according to him. Some experts are saying that that's an outright lie and part of his ploy to whitewash himself, to make himself palatable to the West so as to avoid Western sanctions and Western attacks. What do you make of those criticisms?
I think it's very understandable to treat with caution anything that Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani says, but I think it's also, we need to understand there is a path in which terrorist groups enter into politics and do moderate. We saw this in Northern Ireland. I mean, not everyone in the IRA moderated, but the majority did. That is the way out of that sort of conflict. And so if Syria is to have a future, this would be the way out. But the way out will need to involve not just respect for everyone in terms of words, but actually some sort of federal political structure that allows minorities to have their own areas, to do their own thing. Not as rigidly as Lebanon, where that's become a curse, where it's become too brittle to have communalism, but nevertheless a plural federation. And Jawlani is going to be tested on his words, but he has been fairly consistent these last few years, as best we can see. So I think that means the US now needs to engage with him. He's HTS is a listed terrorist group. The US government, other governments kind of engage with listed terrorist groups. I think they need to sort of find an exit ramp to hold him to account so they can begin to engage, because we need the global community to play a role in stabilizing the region, not the global community to intervene in great power competition, but just a way of providing the stability and then help with reconstruction. I mean, this is a shattered country. The economy is destroyed. That's one reason the Assad forces collapsed so quickly. They literally didn't have enough to eat. So the international community is going to help. There's good reason for doing so. There are something like perhaps 8 million Syrian refugees in the immediate region, at least 3 million in Turkey, many more abroad. Many now want to go home. Some tens of thousands have been driving back home. There's a win-win situation in which Syria gets rebuilt, the international community beginning in the region helps with that process and it stabilizes, but it will involve difficult issues of how do you negotiate with at least former terrorists and hold them to account, but also provide them a way of doing something constructive.
This is a regime change that's been welcomed by the US and welcomed by Israel. I guess my question for you is, why is a change in Syria's government being welcomed by the US and Israel?
I think several things. One is that, it's a fait accompli. They're not easily able to change it. If they try to change it, it would come at great cost to everyone, including themselves. That's the history of, the Middle East for decades, but certainly the last 2 decades. So there's some realism there. But it's also the case that people sort of held their nose and tried to avoid the odious stench coming from the Bashar al-Assad regime. It was literally, Pol Pot levels of cruelty and repression. Everyone, I think, is relieved that awful regime is over, and everyone recognises that however great the challenges ahead, it's a better opportunity than what was there with Assad, particularly with Iran and Russia apparently taken out of the picture. So you could imagine this being a good news story, not just for Syria, but for its neighbour Lebanon, and that in turn would be a good news story for Israel. That would be very welcome for America as well. I mean, there's a lot of people that stand to benefit from, we think of great power rivalry as zero-sum game, but this is a case where if a country like Syria can win, its neighbours can win, the global community wins.
If Syria is treated as a win for Lebanon, in what ways, what exactly does that mean?
Well, the game's not over, so we can't sort of take score just at the moment. The point is that if Syria can stabilise as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious federation that delivers good governance in a fairly robust way and allows the rehabilitation of the Syrian economy, the rebuilding of shattered cities, people to come back, and there's a great brain drain from Syria out of the country for the last 2 decades, but that could be reversed with educated Syrians coming and helping rebuild the country. That would give a confidence boost for its small neighbour, Lebanon, that they could do the same thing. Many Lebanese around the world would like to do the same thing. So if Syrians can go back and rebuild Syria, Lebanese diaspora community members from places like Sydney and Melbourne can go back and contribute, as long as it's safe. That's the desire. It's what people want to do. It's the way you deal with massive problems of refugee flows. You try and address the root causes back at home, so people can go back at home and be part of the solution. If Syria and Lebanon can get their acts together, and with Hezbollah largely out of the picture, hopefully forever in terms of terrorism, if not in politics, it is possible in Lebanon, then that's a much better situation for Israel to be dealing with. So as much as we hear this very warlike, bellicose language from leaders like Bibi Netanyahu, the reality is no one gets security until you have political solutions and to have successful neighbours.
And I guess if we were to be a little bit more forward-facing, what do you think we can expect to see out of the region in the next few weeks?
I think we should approach it with caution, but also with optimism. I think we need to recognise this is a great moment for the people of Syria. To see those people coming out of prisons after years, if not decades, that's wonderful. They need help. The diaspora community will want to help. We need to find ways we can help that diaspora community. And, we've got people like Jalani saying they're going to do the right thing, or we need to both give them an opportunity to do something constructive, but also hold them to account. So it's that delicate balancing act. This would be a good moment for the UN to step up and sort of act like the United Nations that we hope it would be. It would also be a good time for the US to say, we're not going to go into any more wars, but we will help nations rebuild themselves so that they don't have refugees flying out of their countries, but that people actually go back and reconstruct. Donald Trump can turn that into a win if he wishes. That would be a very constructive way of approaching it. Similarly, in Israel, if they can turn it into a win and say, this is the stability we want in the region, then everyone benefits from that.
Professor Greg Barton, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
That was Chair in Global Islamic Politics at Deakin University, Professor Greg Barton, speaking with me there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is it for now. Before you go, though, we would love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. And that's a really, really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. So is sharing our social posts. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And don't forget, we will be back in your feeds tomorrow morning for Headlines with Sash. I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.
Listener.